going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Gamarjoba from Georgia, the country, not the state. This is Burn Power coming to you on the Anadrome, the channel where we stop and turn around and go back upstream, not being a thing floating down the stream. And today what we're going to do is we're going to look into a film that just came out called The Ugly Stepsister. And it's basically a retelling of the Cinderella story from the perspective of this supposedly ugly stepsister. And this film, since I saw it last week with a good friend of mine here in Tbilisi, I was fortunate enough to see it on a screen. I have been puzzling over the film ever since, and I went and watched the live action Disney version directed by Kenneth Branagh of Cinderella, which I happen to have on my shelves. Also, I read the Perrault version of the story Cinderella, Cendrillon, and also I read the Grimm's Brothers version of Cinderella, both of which I have on my shelves as well. I don't have all my library here yet, but I've got enough to do this, so let's go into this. Before we do, let me just remind you, the channel needs you. You need to be a specific member of this channel, so you need to subscribe, and then you'll get notices if you want. If you really want to get notices, press the bell icon, but you don't have to do that unless you really, really want to. Press like. You need to, just for the blind idiot gods of the algorithms. You can share this with other people if you think it's worth your time or their time. And if you really want to support the channel, $25 would get you a book of 3 very bizarre little puppet plays that I wrote a few years back. Or you can simply donate and become a member. And here's the new thing. You can become a member of my new Patreon. By the time you read this, it is active already, and there'll be a link down below, but I am loading it up with stuff so that when people first come there, they go like, oh, there's a lot more to what Burn is doing than I thought, and I thought I'd already given you a lot. So, just to say that, there are 5 channels, none of which are making money, which is why you need to support the channel. Okay. Let us move into the film. The Ugly Stepsister is a Norwegian film originally called, let's see if I can do this, Den Stygge Stesøsteren.
Den Stygge Stesøsteren.
It's close enough. I'm not going to try to do it again. It's one of these weird things when you hear someone do it, it's just like, yeah, that sounds simple until you look at the words and try to do it yourself. It's directed by a woman, Emily Blichfeldt, and it's this year. It's a film from this year, and it was in a few select theaters. I was very fortunate. There's a Russian guy who's started this little theater here in Tbilisi called Cinemaholics, and he has some good taste, and he got this film in there, which was at the top of my list from everything I'd heard of horror films to see this year. And yes, indeed, it's a horror film, which means it can be found on the streaming site Shudder. So go check it out there if I interest you in the film. Now, this is not going to be a review. This is going to be a little bit more of an analysis of, not so much the movie, although we will certainly talk about that, but of the Cinderella myth and legend and archetype, and how this film deals with it. And I must say, I've been mulling this over, because I walked out of that film and I thought, that's a very interesting film. And at the same time, I said, well, what about that? And what about this? And what about that? And this is the result. This is not, absolutely not, a fairy tale film for teenagers or children. You need to be a bit older. I would say you got to be at least 20, 21 to really feel this film. And in fact, the film features a lot of black, dark humor. It does have a feminist slant, but some people have criticized it for saying it didn't go feminist enough, because it doesn't paint the women as the good people and the men as the bad people. Pretty much, it's got more of a postmodern sense of ethics and kind of really nerve-wracking body horror. And it skirts briefly over the edge into explicit X-rated territory. And it's set in a hyper-stylized Victorian era. I specifically liked the costumes. And if you are a person who's into retro costumes, you should really look at this film. Tell Karolina Jabrowska. So this is a world without true goodness. And someone could say, much as in our world, but in fact, in my world, the world I live in, I have met true goodness quite a few times. But in this world, Cinderella is absolutely not a virgin. She is very winsome, and she starts off as kind of being up above. Like I say, I don't care if I spoil all the plot. You know what the plot is, although I'm giving you details that are going to ruin this specific version. Because, like I say, this is about the myth. This is not about being cutesy with the plot and protecting you. So if you're that kind of person, you can come back after you've seen it. The prince, in fact, there's an implication that he's diseased. He himself is no virginal creature. The stepsister is delusional to the point of madness. The stepmother is a vile, money-grubbing strumpet. The youngest stepsister is probably the most human character of all, and is given the least time of all to show herself. And there's a stable hand who's kind of horny and on the corrupting side. There is a cosmetic surgeon who in the credits is listed as Dr. Esthétique in the French manner. He is an oily dandy with absolutely eye-shielding nightmare techniques, largely based on actual Victorian-era practices. And this is set in the 19th century. So don't watch this thinking you're watching the Middle Ages or even the early modern era. It's not set in Charles Perrault's 17th, 18th century. Now, having said this, the acting is quite good. And I particularly like the young, ugly, and I put that in quotes and you'll see why in a bit, stepsister, played by Leah Miron, and her name in this version is called Elvira, or Elvira. Also, I'd like to point out that the Cinderella person, who's called Agnes for a while, and then eventually they kind of change her name after she is debased into something like Cinderella in Norwegian, but they just translated Cinderella in the subtitles. Her name is Thea Sophia Loch Ness. I'm wondering if she's related to the Loch Ness Monster, but I don't know why her name is that, but such it is. The last time I saw her was in the series The Last Kingdom, which was about Danes and Anglo-Saxons kind of sparring and killing each other in a long multi-season series. And she plays an absolutely riveting character who's kind of a Danish pagan witch. She really sticks out in that series. Now, this Cinderella starts off as a perfectly spoiled daddy's girl. And this kind of leads us to feel a certain kind of attachment in a 21st century way to Elvira, the ugly stepsister. Now, is she ugly? No. But there's a fine makeup job being done. Something really subtle happens to her during the course of the film. She seems to start off more round-faced and almost piggy-like, and by the end she's a very beautiful girl. She, of course, was a very beautiful girl, the actress, all along. But there's some things done makeup-wise, and I'm not sure, because like I say, they're very subtle. It's really hard to figure out what was done. In typical movie fashion, ugliness is almost never ugly. I mean, I've met people who are truly ugly. That is, say, women who you just go like, oh my goodness, how many times did you pick your skin? You know, why is your chin hanging down? All of this sort of thing. And in movies, you know, there's always this sense where the supposedly ugly person is never as ugly is. And I think that's just it's something you just get used to in movies. But however, Theosophia Loch Ness is a very beautiful woman, and I think both of them have good careers coming to them because they're both fine actresses. Now, this whole emphasis upon the ugly stepsister is going to eventually shift around, and the further we get into the film, the more our Cinderella takes on her traditional role, minus the virginity and the prince's faithfulness. And the ugly stepsister is indeed going to become ugly. After she is transformed through processes which, I'll describe them more in a minute, but you really have trouble looking at them. They're just, ooh, ow. She's going to become ugly by the end, with a capital U and a capital G and a capital L and a capital Y. Truly. There's some scenes right at the end you're just going like, oh my goodness, you know, you just can't even look at her. And that's a fine job of acting. But let's come back to all of that and the transformation process. Let's think about what the story really is about, which is to say it's about Cinderella. Now, we think we all know version, but unfortunately that Disney version, the 50s cartoon, which I haven't rewatched for this, I felt the live-action version probably did the job, and it is considered the best of all the Disney live remakes of their cartoons. And I can see why. And it has elements that are quite, there's some depth to it, even though it's got the usual Disney gloss. I wouldn't call it certainly not Tarkovsky level, but it's also not down in the remake level of so many of these Disney reboots, cash grabs. And Kenneth Branagh, I think, really put some thought into that version. Now, it's quite instructive. I immediately came home and watched that the next evening. It's quite instructive to compare these together. In Kenneth Branagh's version, which is easily better than the original cartoon, Cinderella is the ultimate symbol of true goodness. And her father goes off to deal with some financial or existential crisis and eventually dies. So he's out of the picture. This leaves Ella in the clutches of his manipulative new wife. One of the things that happens at the beginning of Kenneth Branagh's Cinderella is her very good mother dies and kind of passes on the mantle of goodness to Cinderella. But the wife is played by Cate Blanchett, who is just enjoying her role as this evil, spiteful stepmother. And she really just totally humiliates Cinderella. So that, not as far as I think the actual fairy tale suggests, but certainly she is not treated very well. One of the questions that arises is, why does the father marry this woman? It's not answered, but it's a big question. Cinderella does eventually become the ash-tinted servant. But eventually, as in the 50s animated feature, her fairy godmother, played in a comic fashion by Helena Bonham Carter, and this goes with the original, almost all the fairy godmothers in Disney are kind of comic on some level. She arrives, and then we get finally the pumpkin carriage, the lizard coachman, and the rest of it. So Cinderella goes to the ball. She is resplendent in a light blue gown, and that light blue is a very specific kind of shade of color, which kind of sticks with you after you watch the Kenneth Branagh version. She completely mesmerizes everyone, especially the prince. Now, that we're talking about the Kenneth Branagh version here, not the Ugly Stepsister. And there's a glass slipper. Now, the glass slipper shows up in everything, and what's interesting about that is evidently, Perrault, who was writing this, there's a word that was pantoufle de verre or something like that, and it was supposed to mean gray, a gray slipper, but it ended up being called verre, which is glass. So that's how that seems to have ended up in the story. Now, the stepsisters in that Kenneth Branagh version try the shoes on and fail. Finally, we get the moment where the shoe fits. Everything's happily ever after. And there's one truly great moment in the Branagh version, which I don't think shows up. No, it does show up in Perrault. But where Cinderella forgives the stepmother at the end. And of course, the stepmother can't accept it, because I think there's something about the evil person who can't admit what they've done, because that's far darker than what the victim has gone through, to admit that this is who I am. But it's an amazing moment, and she just says, I forgive you, which I think is really interesting given where we are today, where forgiveness seems to be so far from people's thought processes. We've moved so far from what would have been the Christian worldview, which even with people who knew they were mistreating others, knew they had to forgive other people. Whereas now, when you see people protesting all sorts of things, the idea of forgiveness just doesn't seem to be there anymore. So let's now go back even further to the original fairy tales. Like I said, I have the Perrault and the Brothers Grimm on the shelves, and so I got them down, and I have an older version of the Brothers Grimm. It's not one sanitized for later use. Now, some people say there are possible Cinderella origins in ancient Greek and Roman sources, and they point out certain women who married noblemen and such like this. But it turns out that the first real version we have was Italian, and it was written by a certain Giambattista Basile Pentamarone. And the story was called, this was 1634, and the story was called Cenerentola. So it sounded a bit like Cinderella. And they all deal with cinders or ashes. Now, I don't have that version, but as soon as I realized it was out there, I said, why don't I? And so I just ordered it. So it's somewhere out there coming towards me. Charles Perrault, or Charles Perrault, the French writer, in 1697, wrote a very Catholic, moralistic romance out of it, Cinderella in French. And we'll discuss that in a bit. And then the Brothers Grimm came along in 1812 and wrote Aschenputtel, which translates into Little Ash Girl, but that's kind of what Cinderella means anyway. Now, in the Perrault version, Cinderella is an archetype of beauty and grace. She forgives her sad sisters, and this changes their lives for good. In fact, let me read you the very end, obviously translated into English, of the Perrault version. And now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady whom they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the ill treatment they had made her undergo. Cinderella took them up, and she embraced them and said that she forgave them with all of her heart and wanted them always to love her. She was taken to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought she was more charming than before, and a few days after married her. Cinderella, who was no less good than beautiful, gave her two sisters lodgings in the palace, and that very same day matched them with two great lords of the court. So that's how the Perrault version of Cinderella ends. And it's all about forgiveness. So let's go to the Brothers Grimm. And here's how they end the piece. When the wedding with the prince was to be held, the two false sisters came, wanting to gain favor with Cinderella and to share her good fortune. When the bridal couple walked into the church, the older sister walked on their right side and the younger on their left side. And the pigeons pecked out one eye from each of them. Afterwards they came out of the church. The older one was on the left side and the younger one on the right side. And then the pigeons pecked out the other eye from each of them. And thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness as long as they lived. So, that's radically different. Evidently, the Perrault wanted, as a Catholic, to really emphasize the notion that we really should forgive even the worst of people. Whereas the Grimm's brothers, now what they're doing is they are putting things into their own words, but they've been collecting these. This is an act of romantic nationalism for them. They are part of the new type of person, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Empire and such. Not that they're directly connected to it, but they certainly are infected or affected by that revolutionary fervor. So they see the real darkness of these people, but they're just recounting the old tales. And these old tales, eye for an eye. So these sisters go off blinded. Now, here's what's interesting to me. The film is called The Ugly Stepsister. And in both versions, the sisters are never described as physically ugly or repulsive, but inwardly they are. Perrault says, once there was a gentleman who married for his second wife the proudest and most haughty woman that was ever seen. She had by a former husband 2 daughters of her own who were indeed exactly like her in all things. He had likewise by another wife a young daughter, but of unparalleled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. So the young daughters are very much like the proud, haughty woman, very much the Kate Blanchett character. Although I would say they're probably prettier than the 2 girls in that film. In the Perrault version of the fairy tales, we have the fairy godmother. In the Grimm's brothers version, we have birds who do everything for I want to say Snow White, but that's there's very much a connection there. The godmother in Perrault is much more like a regular godmother. She's not magical. In Grimm's, everything's birds. They're dressing her, they're feeding her, they're going to do things. So it's animals being heightened kind of magical realism. In Perrault, we have pumpkins and animals that turn into the carriages and footmen. In the Grimm's, the carriage is already assumed. It's never discussed how it came into be. In Perrault, the clock strikes midnight. In the Grimm fairy tales, there is no clock striking midnight. And in fact, in both Perrault and Grimm, it's not one night. It's a multi-night festival, and Cinderella comes back more than one night. And I think that's really fascinating. Of course, Disney turned it all into this one night. And that works for a movie because you don't want to go back and back again. But often in these older fairy tales, things happen in 3s. Sometimes, as in these cases, 2s. And both versions leave a large, unexplored question hanging over the proceedings. And that question is this: why is the father so enamored by the stepmother? And more importantly, he doesn't die. And why doesn't he see Cinderella's pain and abuse? So Perrault actually ends all of his fairy tales with a moralistic poem or 2. I was going to read them, but this is probably going to go on long enough the way it is. So that's the traditional Cinderella. Disney has extracted the Christian moral structure and added kind of low comic elements, as C.S. Lewis mentioned when he saw Snow White for the first time. He felt that the dwarves in there were low comic creations. Didn't really fit the story. He liked his fairy tales to be fairy tales. And Disney also eliminated the strange relationship of the father to the stepmother, and certainly eliminated the dark, brooding character that we see in the Brothers Grimm. Angela Carter did a series of very dark fairy tales in her book called The Bloody Chamber, where she goes through things like Bluebeard, Beauty and the Beast, Little Red Riding Hood, and the Company of Wolves. But she doesn't do Cinderella. However, her version, I highly recommend The Company of Wolves as a movie by Neil Jordan, which really is dark fairy tale territory. While she doesn't have a Cinderella version, at least not to my knowledge, I could be wrong about that, but I have the book and it's not in there. The Ugly Stepsister follows along with the Angela Carter treatment. And so, like Carter, we have whispers of darkness that leak through everything like blood stains on a wooden floor. So let's go back to the beauty treatments that are shown. Now, all I can say is there's a treatment for the nose that will have you grabbing your seat the whole time. Evidently, this was an early version of nose surgery, rhinoplasty, which involves breaking the nose, and it is difficult. The worst of all the treatments proves to be one of the people in her ballet studio hands her a little egg and says to swallow that, and then she'll get a tapeworm, and then she will lose weight. And so dutifully, she ends up taking it in a kind of state of despair, and she does lose weight and becomes the much more beautiful woman that the actress actually is. Now, the scenes surrounding this are truly grotesque. With the vampiric mother last seen swallowing something shaped like a worm. I'm not going to go into all the details. You do need to see this for yourself. So let me point this out. The scenes with the tapeworm are not actually scenes with a tapeworm. That is to say, what's inside of her is much thicker, much bigger, much longer. Not much longer, but much more substantial than a tapeworm. You see it actually moving around in her belly and such, as if there's a big mouth down there that's eating all of her food for her. That's not how tapeworms work. Tapeworms are segmented, flat worms. And the problem with them is they get into your intestines and they just start feeding on everything. And they're like, well, they are parasites. And they also, in real parasitic cases that are deep and dark, and you could actually be born with tapeworms because the eggs aren't, they have the egg about this big. The eggs are almost invisible. So you could get this as a very young child, and your whole life would be taken over by it. You'd probably die from malnutrition. One of the reasons we look at each other for symmetry is because of what the tapeworm can do to your face. Tapeworm is a dark creature, and there are different kinds, but basically they're segmented. A friend of mine, Matt, in Alaska, got a picture of, no, not Matt, it was Tom, got a picture of a tapeworm infestation coming out of the behind of a bear. And it's all these ropey-looking, stringy-looking things. And again, I don't know, maybe you've dealt with cat excrement and seen little bits that look like almost pieces of paper in there. That's tapeworm. Now, what they do with them in here isn't just dark, it's nightmarish. And the images that go with, especially, shall we say, removing the tapeworm, not that this is where reality and the film part company, you can't just simply remove a tapeworm by pulling it out. What we get instead is something that is more metaphorically violent and pretty intense. So, while I wouldn't recommend The Ugly Stepsister for the average moviegoer, nevertheless, I think this movie isn't directly about the fairy tale, although the fairy tale is certainly used as a beginning point. Like I say, it's a lot closer to the spirit of Angela Carter, of turning these fairy tales into this more modern kind of idea, or postmodern idea in this case, where there's no one you can trust. Like I say, I've met plenty of people in my life who are pretty good, whereas Cinderella eventually becomes a symbol for goodness, but she isn't that in the beginning of this. And the stepsister, whom at first we kind of sympathize with her delusions, wanting her to find something, eventually she goes way too far, and there's no way you can sympathize with her. At the very end, she's a completely ruined creature. And that's where we start having a modicum of some kind of hope for her, like, what's her life going to be after the movie's over? Now, I think what this film is really about, I think it's really about cosmetic surgery and the nightmarish treatments we are now investing in ourselves. And I think young women, particularly in our times, are subject to this. I mean, one could just go on listing all of the treatments. I've been seeing people with lip fillers here recently. Just suddenly, they just started sprouting everywhere, and when they first get them, they're like ballooned, but later their lips end up like ducks. And I've seen, for some reason, they just started showing up this year. I had never seen that much of them before this. And I'm saying to myself, why? Why would you do this to yourself? Don't you realize you went from being, from what I could tell, a fairly attractive woman to being something like a sideshow freak? All for what? Because you're staring at the screen and you want to have this weird kind of image. And I think that that's what this film is really about. You know, when you consider what we do to ourselves these days, whether it's in the countercultural zone of tattoos and piercings, or the cosmetic zone of nose, lips, breasts, and I am sure as we go along, it's going to be in the cybernetic realm as well, as we become more cyborgian ourselves. So this film, to me, now, this isn't a film for everybody. It's dark, it's intense. If you don't like dark, intense films, stay away from this. If you ever think about watching it, streaming it, make sure there are no children in the house. This thing is dark, really, truly dark. However, the value of it is, I think anyone who's watching this film who is considering or has had work done on themselves will be confronted with this metaphorical set of images, which really makes you ask, why didn't you just stay yourself? You're not becoming, in this Gnostic sense, the true you. You already are. Now, how do you just simply be that? And where does beauty fit in? And all of these questions. The film holds out hope at the very, very end that maybe she finally understands. And it's her sister, the younger stepsister, who isn't considered ugly, who helps her. And in the end, she becomes this damaged, deformed, geek-like creature, but she is rescued by her sister, who takes her away out into the world. And I think there is this just shard of hope at the very end. It's very meaningful. So, like I say, who should watch this? People with really strong sense of themselves. People who don't get blown away by basic horror imagery. People who... But at the same time, I think a lot of horror people are going to find this too artsy. But I think it's more than that, and I think it's worth a watch. And I never want to see any sort of dubbed version of this, because it's really good in Norwegian as it is. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for watching. Like I said, I've spoiled the whole plot, or at least a lot of it. But the one thing I can't do is prepare you. I've shown you a few stills along the way. But you know what? I cannot show you any... There's no stills that even gets close to showing you what this is in this film. So go in, steel yourself, watch it, and as I've been telling my friends, I think the most philosophical films of the 2020s, and certainly this has been developing through the teens, have been horror films. And this film certainly is one. So if you're in the mood to challenge yourself, to challenge your thinking with some really intense imagery, go see this film. If you're not, stay 100 million meters away, 100 million miles away. So, from Tbilisi, Georgia, where we say droibit, which means, just temporarily, we'll just be gone from each other a little while, and then we will indeed meet again. And look up my Patreon in the link below.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.
I'm going crazy. I've lost my mind.